something we're discussing, just so it makes it easier for us and the chairs to figure out the order of when to select people.
Okay, it's 6:02, and I'm Cynthia Krass. I'm the chair of the Issaquah Transportation Advisory Board, and I'm going to call this meeting to order on March 18th. Our first order of business is approval of the minutes. Did everyone have a chance to review the minutes for the February 24th board meeting? I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second? Is there a second?
The second, the motion.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? All right, well, that makes it easy. Stephen, I'm not seeing any that I don't recognize, so I'm assuming we don't have anyone signed up for public comment. Okay. If we get anybody jump on and we're doing well, if it's okay with you, I may invite that individual. Okay, so that takes us right to item 4 on the agenda. Oh, and by the way, I meant to say thank you to Sujata for jumping in at the last minute. Family emergency and was not able to be avoided, and redundancy is good. We have a chair and a vice chair, and it worked the way it did, so I really appreciate that. Okay, so I think we're going right into item 4A, the streetscape improvements.
Yes, thank you. So tonight, I'm going to briefly summarize what the downtown streetscape plan is, the work that's been done so far, and what's next for implementing the plan, and what it means for our downtown. Many of you may not know what the downtown streetscape plan is, so I'll start with just a brief summary on the history of the plan. It's the result of a visioning process that started in 2016 and ended in 2017 with the intention of establishing a new vision and redesign for the downtown in Old Town during a time of rapid change in the city. And the process to develop the plan included several community outreach events, board and commission discussions, council discussions, and ultimately it was a partnership between the city, the Downtown Issaquah Association, and all the downtown businesses. And the reason I'm giving you an update on this plan and our work on it is because it fits actually in with the vision of the mobility master plan, which will lead us into more of a multimodal based community and transportation system where people feel a lot more safe and comfortable to get around without having to drive their car, and creating more public spaces for people to get around and really enjoy the community. And so as part of this process, like the guiding principles for our master plan, several major goals were established to guide the redesign. And the first was embracing the outdoor areas as public spaces with community values. Second is the preservation of neighborhood values and design and function of the downtown. And next is the establishment of an environment that made it easier for people to access the businesses, something that people had complained about before. And the fourth was to create a more of a walk-friendly environment. And last is to ensure that improvements included parking access, as you know, use of cars is still kind of the primary method of people getting around and accessing some of the businesses downtown. And this led to a redesign with wider sidewalks, more trees and plantings, the establishment of a festival street to support more frequent outdoor events, and outdoor furniture to make the downtown a little more welcoming for people who visit. And as you imagine, this resulted in a fairly large project, and so we had to split it into multiple phases to make it easier to and more feasible to implement. And this also, by breaking it up, it also minimized the impact on the downtown businesses. It's fairly difficult to support our downtown businesses when the entire corridor is closed because it's under construction. So the work that's been done so far, and since 2017, we started work in late 2018 going in 2019. The city completed the first phase on the southern end of downtown on Front Street between Sunset Way and Alder. And this included wider sidewalks, new plantings, new furniture, bike racks, and new trash receptacles. If you hadn't had a chance to go downtown yet, I'd suggest kind of walk through so you can kind of see the difference. You can really see a significant change in the feel of downtown when south of Alder and north of Alder, just how the older downtown looked and then how the newer downtown just kind of changes the feel for that visiting downtown and enjoying the space. So this year we're getting started on the next phase, which is to build out the festival street on Alder. And the purpose of this festival street is to provide a public space where people could comfortably walk or rest to enjoy the downtown area. Unfortunately, we don't have all the funds, which calls for about 1.5 million to fully complete the second phase. So we're getting started on phase 2.1, which includes the installation of overhead catenary lighting, very similar to the picture that you see on the screen, where you have the overhead lights and posts. And it includes murals, walkway murals, wall murals, to add a little bit of art to the festival street. Planter boxes to help kind of separate the space between where vehicles go and where people are kind of walking. And if the budget allows, we're going to be purchasing additional street furniture to make it more of a more welcoming space. And we've been in the process of finalizing the design, and now we're moving on to hiring a contractor, which is the purchasing of materials so we can start the construction in late spring, early summer this year. And when we have the budget finalized, or when we have the available budget, we'll finish phase 2, which includes resurfacing the entire roadway, which likely won't be pavement. It might be brick. It might be some type of more aesthetically pleasing surface with a cleaner look, and it'll include street level sidewalks. So everything will actually all be one level to make it a lot more comfortable for everyone. And again, this was more of an informational update from our project team, and we wanted to make sure that we shared this information as we start implementing more of the project. Are there any questions on anything about the project?
This is Tom, and I have one question about if you could go back to the slide that showed the cross section of the street to see the difference
Sure.
between the sidewalk side and the planter strip side.
Right here.
Good. So I can see the at level connection with the street sidewalk part. Okay, thanks.
And this cross section, even though one side is higher than the other, this is actually because of the section in front of Vino Bella and Montalcino's. Because of elevation change where the access to the business is, we had to have an elevated sidewalk. But we took advantage of the design and we're looking to implement a seating wall at the edge of this sidewalk so that it's more of a kind of the pedestrian friendly area. Any other questions?
Erica has a question. And so does Micah. Erica and then Micah.
What accessibility measures were taken into account for this festival street?
Sure. In terms of ADA access or access to the businesses themselves? ADA access?
Yeah, but I guess I'm interested in both now.
Okay, so when you actually make everything one level, you are actually making it much more ADA accessible than if you were to have elevated sidewalks and curb ramps. Because you're not having to deal with elevation change and ramps to be able to change, cross a street to access any of the businesses. We'll have to have, in front of Montalcino's, curb ramps that get you to this higher sidewalk and seating wall area. But for the rest of the street, it'll all be one area. And so there will be openings between plantings and landscaping that would allow people to cross the street easily, much more easier than before. And then for access to the businesses, a lot of it is really just going to be maintained of how it looks now and making it easier for people to find the entrances for the businesses.
Thank you.
So it looks like from the picture that the travel lane, there's no car traffic, which I think is great for this. Is that 24/7? And if so, what was the feedback or the planning feedback from businesses or planning on, how else they're going to do parking? I do like that they're doing this, but I also, want to make sure that we're still able to get people to that area. And then just a note on the sidewalk being flat. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I forget the name of it, but there's a name for design where instead of making something ADA accessible and it's like a separate entrance, it's a separate way to access something. It's the same way for everyone. And so like flat sidewalk, there is no, I have to go use the curb cut. Everyone's going on that together.
I don't know if it's the term you're thinking of, but Woonerf is a term that typically refers to this style of street design. And that's WOONERF, or pronounced kind of with a V at the beginning. And then in terms of your comment on the travel lanes, the original idea for this design was to create a space that would be easily closed for outdoor festivals, which is why you're seeing people standing in the travel lanes and not cars. But when there's not an outdoor festival, it would allow access. But the conversation actually following last year's streetery is kind of changing what the desire for this festival street might be. And so once we've constructed the festival street, we'll probably have that conversation of, do we actually need to have vehicle access through here, or do we want to just permanently close it off? And so that's a conversation we'll have later on. We're not having that yet. But that is something that would be of interest, I think, for the board.
And then one small question. It looks like from the drawing, there's trees. I'm assuming there's other obstacles to prevent a vehicle from accidentally traveling into the sidewalk when that street is open.
Actually, for when you have sidewalk or street level sidewalks, the original design is that you actually don't have very many obstacles at all. It's typically landscaping, not much signage. And the reason for that is they found when you do that, cars go slower. Cars don't go very fast. And they go slower than even the posted speed limit in a lot of areas. And this has been proven in some cities in the US, but in a lot of prominent areas in Europe where they've been implementing this design for a long time. But you'll find not everybody has really embraced that. So one good example of that is Park Lane in downtown Kirkland. They implemented street level sidewalks, but they lined the entire roadway with bollards on both sides. There's pretty much a bollard every 6 to 8 feet down the whole way. Eventually, the intention is to take it out and close off the street in the future when the businesses are comfortable with it. So they're more of taking a more phased approach towards closing the street down and creating more of this promenade of where people are walking down the entire width of the roadway. Any other questions or comments?
David had a question he put in the chat about Alder officially closing.
Alder officially closing?
David, why don't you just say your question? Did we lose him? David, are you on mute? Let's see.
Sorry. What I met, Stephen, was Alder West is closed right now. And I don't know that it's officially closed. I think it's just closed. And then you gave the dates that, in fact, construction was going to start. So it looks to me like, after talking to Christina from Downtown Association yesterday, that Alder's probably going to be closed for quite a while. Maybe not permanently, as you indicated, but still, I'm just wondering when that official date was that it closed Alder Street West, because Alder Street East is still open. I see that.
Correct. And a lot of the reason for keeping Alder Street on the east side, where Domino's and Subway are, is to allow those businesses access to because a lot of them are delivery and pickup based businesses, and we want to make sure we are able to maintain a lot of that access. On the west side, where Vino Bella and Montalcino is, that is closed to kind of support the outdoor seating areas, particularly as part of the COVID-19 recovery strategies. And your question was on the date. I believe they're extending that closure until about May. I don't know how that's going to line up with our construction quite yet. We'll know in the next few weeks on timing. So it may open back up before we actually start construction and closing it again.
And then Mike, another question.
So I'm pretty confident this is already happening, but as you mentioned, Subway and Domino's there, I'm hoping that when that decision, or if that decision is made to permanently close it, that there's consultation with the businesses for their leases, because there's the possibility some will want to move to a location that does have regular car access direct to them.
Yes, yeah. The conversation on closing Alder Street permanently hasn't started, but when we do have that conversation, it'll likely be like a year or two process, and that'll include all the downtown businesses. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
And I do know that Streetery is coming back under a new name. And I believe Christina told me last night that Streetery is going to start on the weekends again at the end of April. I'm almost positive that's what she said, through October 1st. So I get it that that's going to probably be closed for sure on the weekends all through the summer.
Potentially, if that's what they're going to be proposing. So this year, just to let the board know, the Streetery last year, the Streetery was kind of a partnership between the city and Downtown Association and the downtown businesses. And so the city invested in the road closure and getting barricades for the businesses to set up outdoor seating. This year, the city is handing that off to the Downtown Association to manage. And so they'll be proposing kind of what the Streetery will look like this year, potentially start, and the dates on when it'll happen. Any other questions on the Streetscape plan?
I was just going to make a comment, Stephen, and just say before we move on that I really appreciate just the update, and it's also really nice to know what things are just updates and what, keeping along this theme of what kind of feedback you're looking for, being clear this is just, an update. But I think it's a really, really good idea, because I do think that the board, in addition to only giving advice, is also going back the other direction and, communicating with our neighbors and friends and other Issaquah folks. And so it's just always nice to be in the know. So I think it's great. And I also think it's super cool. And I love the seating wall.
Great, thank you.
Sounds like with that, is it time to move on to 4B, Complete Streets Policy Update?
Yes, I'm going to hand that off to John.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to get my presentation loaded for everyone.
And to fill everybody in on this next presentation, which is informational, it's kind of follow up on questions staff received from the board at our last meeting, which was to get a little more information about what Complete Streets is. Even though the work is kind of near completion in terms of amending the city's policy, we have enough new members on the board. We wanted to make sure that everybody still understood the work that's going on. And I'll hand it off to John.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Stephen. I'm John Mortensen, the Transportation Engineering Manager, and tonight I'm here to talk about Complete Streets and provide an overview. As I mentioned, the goal of the presentation will be to provide an overview, and that'll be the majority of the presentation, and then also hit a little bit on how we use a Complete Streets policy and what the city is proposing for our Complete Streets policy, and talk about what comes next. The streets of our cities and towns are important parts of our community. They allow our children to get to school and parents to get to work. They bring together neighbors and draw visitors to neighborhood stores. These streets are designed for everyone, whether young or old, on foot or bicycle, in the car or in the bus. But too often, they are only designed for speeding cars or creeping traffic jams. Now, in communities across the country, a movement is growing, the complete streets. States, cities, and towns are asking their planners and engineers to build roads that are safer, more accessible, and easier for everyone. In the process, they're creating better communities to live, work, play, and shop. To answer the question, what are complete streets? They're for everyone. They are designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, pedestrians, bicycles, motorists, public transit users of all ages and abilities are able to move safely across a complete street. Complete streets make it easy to cross the street, walk to the shop, bicycle to work. They allow buses to run on time and make it safer for people to walk to and from train stations. Most Americans feel providing more transportation options will reduce congestion and so we won't have to build and expand roads. And I think that's really important because if you look at what we've done as transportation officials over and over again, a road will get congested, we'll widen it. If you look at the freeways like 405 or I-90, as soon as we add more capacity and more lanes, those lanes get filled up with cars. And so we have a tremendous opportunity to convert short trips from driving to walking or bicycling. In fact, even though walking is almost 11% of all trips, a full third of Americans report that they haven't taken a walking trip in the last week. And studies show how unsafe people feel on the roads in our communities, the lack of sidewalks, poor lighting, and crosswalks. These problems with the built environment keep people from walking and biking and getting to transit. And likewise, for many low-income communities, these are the only way for residents to get physical activity. Between 2001 and 2009, the average number of miles driven by people between the ages of 16 and 34 dropped by 23%. Compared to older Americans, millennials take fewer and shorter trips and take a larger share of trips by walking, bicycling, and other modes. The number of high school seniors with a driver's license has significantly dropped by 12% from 1996 to 2010. And 4 out of 5 millennials say they want to live in a place where they have a variety of options to get to their jobs, school, or daily needs. And more than half would have said that they would consider moving to another city if it had better and more options for getting around. Incomplete streets are unsafe. Between 2003 and 2012, there were over 45,000 pedestrian fatalities, and over half of them occurred on arterial roadways, which are typically designed to be wide and fast and move a lot of cars. Over 60% of the fatalities were on roads with a speed limit of 40 miles per hour or higher. These roads are just meant for cars, not for pedestrians or bicycles. Many communities currently have overworked street networks that force neighborhood traffic onto larger arterials. This creates unnecessary traffic congestion and can be dangerous for drivers. In San Francisco, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority estimates that the city's downtown will be gridlocked with auto congestion within a generation due to population growth. In order to keep the busy street network or the busy networks in growing areas operating more smoothly, they need to be designed, built, maintained, and operated for all users, whether driving, bicycle, walking, or taking transit. A key part of why we're looking at complete streets is the inequity for Latinos and African Americans have a higher rates of pedestrian fatalities than non-Hispanic whites. The rate of pedestrian fatalities for African Americans and blacks was higher than it was for non-Hispanic white Americans by 43%, and for Hispanics it was higher by 60%. Low-income census tracts also see higher numbers of deaths of pedestrians than middle and high-income census tracts. A design policy ensures that the entire right-of-way is planned, designed, constructed, operated, and maintained to provide safe access for all users. Creating complete streets means transportation agencies must change their approach to community roads. By adopting complete streets policy, similar to what Stephen's been working on for the city of Issaquah, communities direct the future of the transportation system to be designed and built and everything for all users. And this makes our community a better place to live. A complete streets policy is not a special project. It's not it's more of a policy. I kind of view it more like a philosophy of how you go about designing and building your roads. And it's not about special treatment or the implementation of complete streets is meant to be flexible and context sensitive. And as the presentation continues, I'll show some examples of different uses of complete streets for different environments. And by adopting a policy like the one that the city is considering adopting, that doesn't mean that all the roads and streets have to change at once. This will happen a little bit at a time. It could be when we're repaving a road and we look for an opportunity to expand a bike lane, or it could also be a bigger project, but it's a way of how we'll go about managing our transportation system. And a complete streets policy won't address all concerns, which still need attention. Complete streets policies are an important piece of the puzzle to ensure that our communities are fiscally and physically healthy. Complete streets can be applied to both rural and urban environments. This example is a 2-lane rural highway or county road, and to accommodate other modes of transportation, it has a shared use path on the side of the road for bicyclists and pedestrians to use. This example of a complete street is in a local neighborhood where the street's narrow to encourage traffic to drive slowly. It's got sidewalk and a landscaping area. And besides the slowing down the cars with the skinnier streets, it's easier for pedestrians to cross the street. Main streets in urban areas can also be designed for all users. In this example, we've got bike lanes and bulb outs for pedestrian crossing. So once again, the crossing's not so long, sidewalks, some landscaping, and an illumination system to light up for the users of the street. A complete street in a high density commercial area is this example where It allows people to walk and access businesses. And this last example of a complete street is another urban area where a bike or bus lane was added in order to accommodate transit. And by doing that, we're able to move more people than if that lane was solely for the use of cars. The slide has a few links. That way, if you wanted to learn some more, the Smart Growth of America website is home to many resources, including policy tracking and examples, information on changing policy from advocacy to implementation, links to research and publications. They also have a blog with newsletter, and if you have Twitter, you can follow their Twitter account, which is a great way to stay up to date on complete streets and transportation issues in general. Now, I did say I was going to talk a little bit about the complete streets policy that Stephen had been working on, and I believe we presented it to the tab, and so it's going to be going to the city council pretty soon. We're making sure that we've met the SEPA requirements, which we believe so, but we're just double checking. And then once this policy is enacted, it'll expand on the city's, it'll be a more complete version of a complete streets policy that'll continue the direction that began with the mobility master plan for ensuring that our transportation network is designed and built and planned for, operated and maintained for all users. And thank you. And does anyone have any questions?
Christy, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Took me a minute to unmute. Quick question. So with the policy going forward to the council for approval, I'm curious, is there flexibility measures within that policy if there's a street that perhaps can't meet all of the objectives of the complete streets?
Yes, so the complete streets policy is very much context sensitive to the unique setting. And so for an example, I'll just compare if we're looking at a street up on top of Squawk where it's mountainous and many of the streets don't have sidewalks, that as we're looking at incorporating complete streets with the context sensitivity of Squawk, the solution would be a lot different than if we're on the valley floor, especially in the regional growth center where we're going to have a lot more density. And so it does give us the flexibility to apply the appropriate treatment depending on the environment.
Question from Joseph.
Is the complete streets approach something that's implemented in the master mobility plan, transportation improvement plan, or is it like a separate initiative or policy?
I would describe it as a child of the mobility master plan. So the city has a current complete streets policy, but as part of the mobility master plan called for updating it to meet the current guidelines and to incorporate a lot of the best practices for complete streets.
Hey, I'm going to jump in for a second. This is Cynthia, and just say that when I was reading through the materials and just getting ready for this meeting, I referred back to the mobility master plan, and I came across a diagram that I thought was super helpful, that I thought was worth calling out, and that's about the MMP. It's in the executive summary, and it basically just talks about the difference between plans and then in its relationship to other plans. And it basically says that the MMP informs. It says identifies policy changes. And I thought that was really helpful because the MMP is a plan. And like you said, it's a Complete Streets policy is a child of that, but it's a different kind of child than a project. And I thought that diagram was really useful, and it kind of helped me sort these different plans and wrap my head around their relationship. So I just thought I would throw that out there. And then I see that David Wagner has a comment or question. Yeah.
And then new parts of Issaquah like Talus and the Highlands. What is the goal? What's the big picture for complete streets? Which means how many of those streets do we see? And what I would also say is complete streets for some of our streets are like, I live on Dogwood right now, so Dogwood West, the way I see it, is a complete street. Would you agree? Dogwood West is a complete street.
I'd have to confess that due to the pandemic, I have not driven in Issaquah in a long time, and
come on down. It's fun
to give you a good answer.
Come on down. It's fun. No, what I'm thinking is there's got to be a big picture of how many streets we have in Issaquah. As I said, Talus, downtown, South. Well, not so much South Cove, but what's the big picture for the number of streets that we will have to work on to make complete streets?
Well, I would characterize it not necessarily as what do we have to work on, more as we work on a street, we look at it with a context-sensitive approach. And so for a street that already has facilities for all users, that also meets all the ADA requirements. For that one, yeah, like this one, I think, so this is Northwest Dogwood, and this does look like a complete street for the
Correct.
situation where you have sidewalk, you have the travel lanes aren't too wide, and you have planter strip. And so in this one, as you look at it, you would consider it a pretty good street.
I just tell you out of a historical perspective, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, what a complete street was then and what it is now is totally different. But that's just a comment.
Well, and the interstate system was born in the 1950s. And so that was a time period with the fast food restaurants taking off and interstate travel, where for transportation, that was the direction the country was traveling at full speed.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so now when you build Talus, isn't it a requirement that those who are building out Talus have to have those streets as complete streets, and that's in their budget, correct?
Right. And I would say for both Talus and the Highlands, that being planned communities that began, I believe, in the late 90s, that a lot of the things that we would be looking for, those neighborhoods and communities do have.
So there's got to be a balance there, especially of Old Town, of all the streets that we have. How many more? I guess I'm not stating it clearly. Forgive me for that. I think you get the drift of what I'm trying to say. There's got to be a balance of how many more streets in Old Town and anywhere else in the city that we need to work on to make complete streets.
It definitely is a balance, and it is very neighborhood to neighborhood specific. And Without completely thinking of everything for Old Town, I would think one of the biggest priorities to making Old Town a complete street, at least once you get off the arterials, would be to a lot of the sidewalk gaps in Old Town would be a huge step to making that neighborhood have complete streets.
Correct. I was on a long time ago when I worked for Issaquah School District. We dealt with the sidewalk issue because it wasn't safe for students to walk to and from. Example, Issaquah Valley. This little path that's on Newport doesn't make it a complete street because it's not that safe for students to walk to and from school. Hence, that requires school buses to have to transport students due to the state law to make those streets safe. Truthfully, I guess Newport Way is not a complete street or right of way. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to include the roundabouts. But I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to take too much time, but I'm trying to make a really valid point. And that is, do we know, as Issaquah sits today in its development, how many streets are out there that have to be done? That probably doesn't even give us a total estimated value of what it's going to cost to get those all complete streets. And we can't do it all overnight. I get that.
If I could jump in, John, one thing that can help kind of identify or at least address your question, Dave, is in the mobility master plan, we identified all the gaps where there's missing bike facilities, where we're missing walking facilities. And that really gets at a lot of that complete streets question of how many roads. We didn't really add it up like the total number of roads is missing everything, but we have identified streets where there's only a walkway on one side when the policy is calling for two, or there's no walkway at all, or there's no bike facility. One thing that we still need to work on is the identification of transit accommodation on roadways, but we haven't really identified what we want our transit network to look like. We have kind of the foundation that Metro and Sound Transit has created for us today, but we haven't really created that for ourselves in terms of identifying, this section of Newport should accommodate this type of transit service. And so this is what's missing. And so that's something that we'll need to work on in the future. But in terms of like non-motorized access, we've done a pretty good job of identifying a lot of those gaps. Does that help answer your question?
Thank you, Stephen.
Back to you, Cynthia. You're on mute right now.
It keeps telling me I can press the space bar to unmute temporarily, but it never seems to work. Anyway, John, did you have anything else to add, or does that conclude your presentation?
That concludes everything for me.
Thank you. So we're doing pretty well on time. I think we're just pretty close to tracking according to the agenda, maybe a couple minutes ahead, which is great. Stephen, you're going to talk about the pedestrian crossing guidelines, which is going to be the main theme. Looks like, judging by the dedication
like
and time.
Jerry has a question too. Before we move on.
Thanks. Missed that. Jerry, go ahead.
I entered it a little bit late, but the question is really simple as far as the definition of complete streets. But not every street is going to be built out completely. So not every street in the network is going to need a bike lane, correct? So you're not going to look at not Dogwood, what's the name of that, Ash Street or something? Ones that don't have a lot of volume aren't going to need the bike lanes, right? And each street has a different definition of what a complete street would be, correct?
Absolutely. And so like during the presentation, when we saw the different examples where there's what fit for a 2-lane rural road versus a dense commercial center versus a
Okay.
main street. And that's just not even scratching the surface of all the different types of streets, and each one's unique, and that the solution needs to be right for the street and the neighborhood and the environment. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just to add on to John's response, you can kind of think of complete streets as an approach or a lens you apply when you're looking at streets of asking the question, how are we accommodating people to walk, or how are we accommodating people to bike? It doesn't necessarily mean we need to have a sidewalk or a bike lane on every road. It's more of just answering those questions. How are those modes of transportation, or those options for people to get around, being accommodated? And not every street will have much at all, other than like a residential street where there's not much volume or anything like that. Could just be established as a shared street where you have low volume, low speeds, and everybody's actually just comfortable sharing the street. There's designs to put in to make everyone feel more comfortable with that, but it's not necessarily we need to put a bike lane and sidewalk on every street.
All right, Stephen, you want to take it away and move on to 4C?
Stephen, you're muted.
Thank you. For this discussion, I'll provide an overview of the crossing guidelines, how the guidelines are used, and the purpose of why we're making changes to the crossing guidelines. And this is more of a discussion, so we're hoping to get feedback from the board. These are the questions we're posing to the board, and I'll bring them back later when we have the opportunity for a discussion. And we're looking for general observations about the changes, whether it's enough to meet the goals of the mobility master plan, and if we're missing anything. And first, I'm going to explain some details about the guidelines, and then I'll focus on the major changes, which is when we'll have that more focused discussion on these questions. So the pedestrian crossing guidelines is more of a collection of city policies and standards as they relate to roadway crossings. It helps us tell the story on why we establish certain policies and standards, and provides guidance on how we use those policies and standards. And it was originally put together back in 2008 to help staff and developers build out safe crossings in a rapidly growing and developing walking network throughout the city. The guidelines also provide a link between national best practice, between what we want to do to keep people safe in this community and what's recommended at the national level. And the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices is one of those primary federal documents we have to stay consistent with as we continue to build out our system. And it's not really important to remember what this document is or what's in it, unless you're an engineer or planner. It's more relevant to know that we have to be consistent with documents like this, so we have legal support for what we put on the roadway. And if something isn't approved in documents like this, then we can't use it, or we have to apply for experimental status to try something new. That way we do have that kind of legal support to put something on the roadway. And there's a couple of ways we use the guidelines. But we should note this is not a formalized document that needs to be adopted by council or the board. You can think of it more like a research paper that explains what our policies and standards are and ensures we're consistent throughout all our projects. To help explain some of the things we're looking at in the guidelines, I'll go over some of the terms to give some context of what we're doing, because the main thing is we're establishing policies that define how standards are used and gives guidance on how to use those policies and standards. So the first term I want to introduce is uncontrolled crossings. And these are locations where sidewalks and designated walkways cross a roadway, but no traffic control is actually installed at this location. This means there's no signage or signals or lights to control drivers or people crossing the roadway at that crossing. You typically see this in residential neighborhoods or just general location where there's not a lot of vehicle traffic or not a lot of people crossing the street. Next term I want to introduce is controlled crossings, which are the opposite of the other one, where there are signs and signals to control drivers and control people crossing the roadway. And technically, what determines when it's uncontrolled or controlled is based on our policy, but it's mostly based on the location characteristics. For example, how many people use the crossing regularly? What's the land use surrounding the location? How many vehicles regularly travel down this roadway that intersects with the crossing? You'll find controlled crossings at locations where there are a higher volume of vehicles traveling on the roadway and large amount of people crossing the road. And the last thing I want to introduce is special treatment. So there are the additional measures that we add on to just a standard crosswalk is what we consider special treatments. And we use these to enhance the usability and the safety of crossings. And so things like flashing lights, special paint decorations or designs, physical barriers are considered special treatments, and they're used so that we can tailor a crossing to specific locations. And you'll find various treatments and packaged solutions in these proposed guidelines, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Now, there's a few reasons why we want to change the crossing guidelines, but the biggest reason is because we're implementing the Mobility Master Plan, which calls for significantly enhanced safety measures to keep people safe in the community and how we use the roadway. And as part of this implementation process, we're updating the street standards and associated policies. So it's necessary to update the crossing guidelines as well, which is what's telling the story of how to use those. Additionally, we update this update also improves our ability to compete for grant funding for projects by improving the tools we use to make safety improvements. We could just update the policies and standards themselves, but if they're not as usable or easier to read, they don't necessarily make it as effective. And so an update to the crossing guidelines help with this. And a lot of this work started back in 2019. We initially spoke with the board and got feedback from the board, which helped guide a lot of the work from a project team, which was made up of staff from multiple departments and a consultant to walk us through the update process. And now we're in that final phase of reviewing the proposed changes with the board and eventually with City Council. One note I want to add here is that the consultant that we selected to develop the Mobility Master Plan was also the same consultant we used to conduct this update. So the purpose of that was to ensure that we were using consistent language and policies between the master plan and these guideline updates. And when we spoke with the board back in 2019, we received the following feedback about the guidelines update. And the first was to keep safety of people walking and biking the highest priority, and to make sure it's consistent with the master plan as it continued to get developed. To keep it simple so people are able to read and understand it, but also ensure equity is considered in the implementation of the guidelines. And while we did a lot of work to think through the equity component, it's not as apparent in the guidelines, only because the implementation of the guidelines in the development of programs and projects is where you really see the equity component really shine. And now that we've gone through the development process with the project team, we're now reviewing the implementation, or at least the finalization of the guidelines. And as I said before, this document doesn't need adoption or approval by council or the board. But we also don't want to move forward on any of the updates unless the board is comfortable with what's being proposed. And so we'll take any edits from the board tonight and bring it back for final review in May if that's deemed necessary, before we bring it to council potentially in June. Before I move to the major changes, are there any questions or comments?
I have a question about in the board feedback from 2019. Like one of the concerns was equity, and is that in equity in like the geographic location of different crosswalks, or of like the who is using it, or both?
Both. Yeah, the discussion with the board was ensuring that safety was being implemented equitably throughout the city, but also making sure that neighborhoods were being looked at consistently for the safety measures as well. Cynthia, I can't see the chat, so are there any other questions?
I'm not seeing any more.
Okay, thank you. So while the guidelines look completely different when comparing the original to what's being proposed now, the major changes we're proposing fall into sort of 4 different categories, and you can look at it as we made a change to the crosswalk policy, which is where we want to establish crossings on the roadway. We changed our policy on where we want to install rectangular rapid flashing beacons, which are those crossing with the flashing lights. You press a button and it just flash yellow and orange lights. And then the third is we put together package solutions for how we want to make improvements for or apply those special treatments for crossings, and I'll explain a little bit more of what that means. And the last was the establishment of a crosswalk removal policy. That's one thing that was never really clear before, was if a crosswalk is installed, what do we do if it actually isn't warranted, or if it's not needed at a location, or potentially that it doesn't make it as safe having the crosswalk actually at a location. Now, with this section of the presentation, I'd like to have a discussion with the board. So I'm going to go through the questions again, and then I'm going to go through each major change, and we'll just go through each one and have a discussion if that's okay. Okay. So again, the questions is focusing on those 4 major policy changes with these questions. Are these changes adequate? Do they match what we intended for the master plan? And are we missing anything? And for the first change, the first major change was the establishment of a more robust crossing policy to determine where and when we want to have crossings in the system. And the previous policy was fairly simple, but didn't really provide enough detail and guidance for us to be consistent in the build out of the system, or the continued build out of the system. So by being more consistent with how we install crossings and enhancements, we actually make the system safer. It's not the existence of crossings that make an environment safe, it's how you use them that actually make them safe. And so let's imagine for a second that we installed a crosswalk at every intersection in your neighborhood. Let's all just kind of imagine that for a second for each of you. Now, how do you tell the difference when a crossing is at a park or a school or a shopping center? You can't, because all the crossings look the same unless people are there. Most drivers can't tell the difference, and that's the perspective we have to take into account when looking at a lot of the crossings and evaluating for crossing installations. Because driver complacency, the more times a driver goes down a roadway and experiences the same thing, when they see that there's no one using a crosswalk, they assume that for every crosswalk they see on that roadway. And so when someone actually does cross the roadway, it's more of a surprise for drivers than if we were a little more specific on where we installed the crosswalks themselves. Now, this is where I'd like to kind of have that discussion with the board of what do members think of the establishment of more specifics on where we want to install crossings.
Well, this is Cynthia. I'll start. And I also want to just give you guys a heads up that by the time we're finished, I'll make sure everybody has been called on it if you haven't chimed in on your own, because I like to make sure we hear from everybody. But I mean, generally, I thought that was really, really useful in reading through the memo, just this idea of being a little bit more analytical about crosswalk policy. I wanted to make sure I understand what you're saying though. Were you saying basically that one of the downsides of having too many or having them be too similar is that drivers are desensitized? So it's not just a cost of installing them, it's actually how it could be interpreted by drivers and they get desensitized and then they're all less safe? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Nope, that's exactly what I was saying. Yes. There is a cost component in all this, and there is a principle in the master plan where we need to invest wisely with money that we have. And installing a crosswalk seems fairly inexpensive, but if you look at it, one crosswalk is about $500, just roughly. So an entire intersection where you have 4 crossings is about $2,000. That's for install or repaint. So if you were to do that with every intersection in your neighborhood, you're already looking at $100,000 just for your neighborhood alone. And crosswalks have to be maintained fairly regularly, depending on the volumes of the street. And so it can be financially irresponsible of us to actually want to install everywhere. But to the point I was originally making, installing too many crosswalks does make it less safe because you are setting a different expectation for drivers when no one's using the crosswalks except for one. Drivers really don't know what to expect to get to those crosswalks.
Yeah, this is Tom. I'll add on to that. It's a term called driver expectation, and it's something that's ingrained in drivers that it becomes habit. If they expect one thing, they expect it at others. Everything from, for example, to get off at a freeway, they expect there to be an on-ramp to get back on if they made a mistake and got off at the wrong ramp. So if they're driving through the road, they see certain ways, they get used to it being that same way. So if something changes or something, so they get used to being it that way. So for example, they drive through a crosswalk and no one's ever there, then they just assume it's ingrained in their their driver expectation part is that no one's there, and they change their driving habits to ignore them.
I think that's an important thing to understand. It looks like Jerry has a comment, and then after that, Sujata has a question.
Yes, thanks. My comment was for the new policy, you do, Stephen, you have listed location, but wouldn't location be defined by how many cars are using that roadway, perhaps? When you say location, I would think you're going to be putting more crosswalks where there are more cars driving on that particular road.
It's about the vehicle volume is part of it, but it's primarily around the number of people actually using the crossing as well. So getting pedestrian counts at a location, but a location was listed on here as part of the new policy because you treat a mid-block crossing different from an actual intersection, and you look at it differently because there's different sight distance requirements you have to consider. And so that's why I listed location kind of at the top of the list.
Right, but I was thinking that for the safety of the pedestrians, the busier the roadway, the more likely you would want a crosswalk there. The traffic volume, the busier the traffic volume.
Yes, there are. When you get to, and I'll get to this one in the package solutions, when you get to higher volume roads, then yes, you do want to have a crossing, but you also want to be strategic on where you have the crossings as well. Because if you have a crossing that's closer to, let's say, a commercial area's entrance is you have a crossing, and then 200 feet away you have another crossing that leads, that's not as close to that entrance to the shopping area. The secondary crossing isn't as necessary as that first one because you are more likely to get people across at that first one than the second one. So the second one is actually deemed unwarranted.
So is this crosswalk policy for low volume roads? I might have missed that. So, and then you have another one for higher volume roads? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So first is the determination of whether or not we want to install a crossing. The policy is to be for residential as well as arterial roadways.
It's the same policy?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
So Sujata and then Micah.
Okay, so I guess, Stephen, I'm sorry, this was like the dumbest question, but is the policy, so that document that's attached in our agenda, that's the policy, right? So, or the proposed, is that the proposed policy? So like all the diagrams and all the figures, all the flow chart, as a process person, I love this policy. So so I guess the question is this attached document what you're calling the policy, or is this attached document the process flow and the decision criteria and the detailed information that you would use to get to, what treatment to be used, but the policy is different? Or is this I'm sorry, is this the policy?
No, it is very confusing. So I think this is actually a really good question. The document itself, what was attached as part of this meeting materials, it's a culmination of multiple policies and standards. So
Okay.
it is more of that process flow to determine what crossing you put in place, but it is more multiple policies and standards, not just one.
Okay, yeah, because at some level you start getting to that vibe of complete streets as you're going through this. You start getting to all of that. So I stopped reading actually after this document. So I don't know if like the actual policy is attached, or maybe I should scroll down a little more. So I apologize for not being totally prepared, but
no, we didn't separate out the policy because we thought actually it would make it more confusing if we just kind of repeated the information and separated them out. So we just kept it at the document itself, which contained all the policies as part of a consistent story, just so you can tell what you're reading.
Okay, so I would say, with the questions you're asking, like I would say that in the if this document is sort of the document that's guiding the development of the policy, and those criteria or those, aspects, location counts, et cetera, are in it, in my mind, that makes sense and that's consistent with what we had described in our master plan. Like these are the kinds of things we would want the city to be considering as they're determining how to implement a crosswalk. So yeah, like if the policy was we should think about these things when we implement a crosswalk, then yes, you should think about these things when you implement a crosswalk. And like as somebody who lives in a suburb, in like a cul-de-sac neighborhood, I would not want a bunch of crosswalks in my neighborhood because it would take me longer to cross the street while I waited for the signal to change than it does right now. So yeah. So I think that these things are good things to consider in a policy.
This is Micah. So for the sight distance, is that just merely visibility to the crosswalk itself, or to the people that might be soon to enter the crosswalk? Like I think of the crosswalks on Front Street, which I think are particularly dangerous in my opinion, because there's street parking right in front of where people will wait to cross. And I'm always much more concerned about dark and rainy nights than I am, a sunny afternoon for pedestrian safety. So sight distance, I almost wonder whether visibility is an additional term or another way to say that really describes it's about visibility of the pedestrians prior to entering the crosswalk. That's important. And then I just had a question on some of the different light up crosswalks, cost for those. So there's the ones that have the things built into the road, and then there's just the flashing signs. I'm assuming the flashing signs are going to be cheaper. I don't know whether there are ones, they all require power to be run, or can some of them, even with our reduced sunny days here, can they be powered by solar and therefore cheaper to install?
Sure, I think that's a good question. The visibility portion in the guidelines, you'll find actually graphics and tables that explains exactly a theorem that we use for determining the visibility, and it is looking at there's an area just before someone enters a crosswalk that's kind of determined as the entrance zone for a crosswalk. That's where we're looked at the visibility, or that line of sight, where a driver is able to see when someone's entering the crosswalk. And it is based on driver perspective to pedestrians enter the roadway, not necessarily a different perspective. So we are looking at how far can a driver see where someone is entering our crosswalk, and there is a threshold where we determine that either parking needs to be taken out to increase that visibility, or landscaping needs to be changed to increase that visibility, but there is a certain threshold we try to meet for line of sight for crossings. And then to your second question on the light up crosswalk costs, we no longer do install the in-road lights where you have the lights installed at each of the painted lines for crosswalks anymore, because they're extremely expensive to maintain, because they break fairly easily, and to fix them you have to dig back into the road to fix it. And so even though they're a little less expensive to install than a lot of the bigger flashing lights, they over time become extremely more expensive over the long run. For the flashing lights, so the rapid flashing beacons that you see now, they're typically around 20,000, but can range up to about 50,000 per installation, and that's for two. Solar power, and that's you can hardwire those lights. Or you can install solar, but our policy is actually to hardwire them because of our issues with solar. Not necessarily because we don't get as much UV light. You'll be surprised that we actually get a significant amount that's enough to power those lights. It's more of that we have a lot of trees that cover up a lot of those signs, and so pine needles and leaves and dirt all build up on the solar panels, which require regular maintenance, either of the landscaping of the trees or of the solar panels themselves. And so unless it's more expensive to hardwire the lighting system itself, solar is the preference kind of in the outside areas of the city, and hardwire is the preference on kind of the inner areas where we already have utility lines installed.
Tom and then Christy.
Oops. I have two comments and a question, really. Comments on the crosswalks. For example, going down Front Street, if I'm a driver and I'm going down and there's a car is coming in the opposite direction, say I'm down by the south of Las Margaritas, and I can't see if there's a pedestrian coming across the walk from behind the car that's right in front of the crosswalk. So usually slow down just in case there is a pedestrian that's coming across there that you can't see. So without the ped buttons on the side, you don't know if there's a pedestrian crossing the crosswalk. But the other thing, an option would be, and I'd ask a question, is at nighttime it's hard to see people in crosswalks, but if you could put an overhead, just string it by a catenary line, an overhead light to light up the actual crosswalk. So if someone's pushes a button that lights up the crosswalk from a light above, then you can actually see the crosswalk. It's a little bit more illuminated with light, and you can see the person. And that may be one way to address it. And I've seen that done in other locations, so that's one option. And then so I understand the new policy versus the 2008 policy is we're still looking at location by location, but we're going to have this other criteria with the pedestrian count, sight distance, local destinations, and proximity to others. as more specific ways to evaluate whether the crosswalk stays or goes, because it's the same criteria whether you remove it or install it and modify it. So I guess that's part of my question is that's what we're being more specific with the new policy by looking at those items. And someone had mentioned traffic counts, and it's probably not a bad idea to have traffic counts in there because that may be, not necessarily you won't put the crosswalk there, but it may be a different way to treat the crosswalk based on the traffic volume. But I think probably the pedestrian counts is probably going to be the primary thing because that's who you plan to be addressing at that specific location.
Yeah, so later in a couple slides, I'll show what the package solutions are, and part of what's being considered for the package solutions is looking at traffic volumes as well as traffic speeds. And so in a little bit, I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Question, Stephen?
Go ahead, David, and then Christy after David.
So I'm looking at the federal guidance, thinking about the crossing and what you talked about for the flashing lights rather than those in the street. Under federal guidance, because I know what Kirkland has, and they have the opposite of that, which I totally agree. Those in-street flashing is going to be a lot more expensive, especially when we go through a snow season where the roads are plowed and they just dig those things up. So according to federal guidance, federal guidance then gives leeway. You can either have the style that we have in the city, or you can have the end. So they're not saying which is better or worse, correct? So,
Correct.
so there is no definitive guidance from the federal. They're just saying have something that lights up that street. And
So
the other one on Tom's comment, I have seen those, Tom, and I agree. You can see the people, especially at night later, but I think that almost moves it to a cost-ineffective basis because you're not only lighting up the crossing, which shows the person, but that's another overhead light, and I don't know that the bang for the buck is there. Those are just a couple questions and comments that I have.
Sure. So to your first question, Dave, on federal guidance. So the manual that I spoke about earlier, it doesn't say which option to choose. That manual is more specific to say what options are approved by federal guidance or the feds on what we can use and that have the legal backing. There are studies that have examined the different options and showed which ones have statistically proven more safe. And so that's a lot of the data that we're using to kind of in the development of the guidelines update is using a lot of the newer studies to kind of support our decisions for which tools we actually want to use. And then on your last comment in terms of streetlights, we have streetlights as actually part of the package solutions to be considered, and a lot of the decision-making process will really be site location dependent. If a light would be warranted, sometimes they are cost effective if you have the utilities and the space to install. They're fairly inexpensive. But if you don't have the utility lines and you don't have the space, then it really ramps up the cost. And so it really just depends on where you want to make improvements. But I think those are all valid points.
Christy and then Erica.
Thank you. So I have a comment and then a question. First comment is I like the context of the new policy. I think there's a lot of good considerations in there that have been missing previously, especially when you put it into context in the conversation of Front Street in the time that I've been working here in Issaquah, twice I've met with the Downtown Issaquah Association directors to identify and look at the crossings and my concern around the safety of folks crossing the road when there's events and such. And so to have that top of mind, I think is important. And then, so this is exciting. And then the second piece is, I know we're discussing policy, but I also like to think about it in terms of implementation once the policy is adopted. And so I was just looking, my question is, you know, in looking at the appendix for the MMP, the collisions involving bicyclists or pedestrians, there's a pretty high volume along Gilman. And as an example, right now, Gilman Boulevard, the redesign's been placed on hold. If you look at the block widths, several of those are 500 feet, maybe more. And we have a need now for crossings, just looking at, you know, having more multifamily now on the valley floor and as we get transit. And so my question is, typically I'm used to new development or redevelopment triggering those types of projects. I don't foresee for some of those block lengths changing very quickly, you know, maybe 10, 20 years where they get shortened up. And so how in the interim with this policy, so the question is, how in the interim would this policy help impact crossings that are needed on the street now?
So you can think of in terms of process flow. So thinking back to our discussion on the TIP. So we had talked about having a budget and filling gaps in our system. In implementation of that, so when we move forward, let's assume the TAP gets adopted with that proposal in mind, where we now have a certain amount of our budget going towards filling those gaps. Some of those gaps are going to include having to install crossings. And so we would then move from implementing the TIP and getting those projects on the ground to now designing what those gaps and crossings should look like. And we'll use the guidelines for that. And on the other side of things, private developers, when they are now developing new areas of the city, they're also going to be using the guidelines to create the crossings for those new areas. So we'll be using the crossings to redo areas as part of our TIP and filling the gaps. And developers will fill kind of the need on the newer side of things.
Do we want to go to Erica? And then I'm also just starting to get mindful of the time, because if I understood correctly, Stephen, you had kind of 4 of these sub discussions. Is that right? So I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to say what they want to say and ask their questions, but let's just try to be a little bit mindful of the time. Erica, go ahead.
I noticed that in neither in like the 2008 policy or like the direction that we're headed now, cost isn't looking like it's a component. I don't know if I'm wrong on that, or if that, I mean, obviously with like our primary focus here is safety over cost. So I don't know if that just factored into that. If you could clarify that for me. And I'm interested in up here in the Highlands, we have a couple of different crosswalks that have holders for like the little flags that you can use. I know it's like, especially around like schools and things. Like, where does that come along into this?
Good questions. Cost. So yes, because we're considering safety, this is more of a technical document to say, if this, you do this. Costs are considered more on how much budget we need to get and the timing. So if we don't have enough budget now, then we'll need to budget more into either the next budget cycle or get grant funding to install whatever the solutions are. But there's some flexibility in those package solutions to say that if you don't have the cost now, you can always add on to the solution later on when you do have the funds to be able to do the full kind of solution that you come up with. So it's not necessarily that nothing will go in, it's more of a timing thing when it comes to cost. When it comes to the flags are considered as part of solutions and one of those options you can consider in the package solutions, but only in specific locations or situations. You don't necessarily want to use flags on a big roadway where it's 5 lanes wide and cars are going 50 miles an hour. They're not as useful there, and people likely won't feel comfortable using them. They're more comfortable using them in areas like Front Street where you have a 2-lane road. Probably more when there's traffic congestion and volumes are going a little bit slower. That's when flags are probably a little more useful. When a 2-lane road, volumes are a little bit slow or volumes are low. And so having lights or any other measure really isn't financially feasible.
Thank you.
Stephen, that's all the questions I'm seeing from folks for this section.
Great, thank you, everyone. I'll move on to the next policy change, which is focused on the rectangular rapid flashing beacons, and that is the lighting systems that you see now, where when you want to cross the roadway, you hit the button and then it just flashes yellow to let drivers know that you are crossing. We didn't have a very definitive policy for this before, and the original policy didn't really provide guidance and was more determined on a case-by-case basis, and we weren't really consistent in a lot of the installations we installed. And so the new policy is providing limits so that when you see these enhancements, you know it's at a location where there's a school or regular use trail or a shopping center where people are crossing the road fairly regularly. So that it's visible to drivers, so that the expectation for drivers is the same at all the locations that these are installed. And part of the new policy, a part of implementing this new policy is we want to limit these installations as well to primarily 2-lane roadways in a lot of situations, because what we found is that the studies that we looked into, these flashing beacons, is that they're less visible on 2-lane roads than they are on 3-lane roads, where you can have a light in the middle of the roadway and you have 3 lights kind of crossing. Just because you get that, you can think of it as driver blindness. You're not necessarily looking at what's at the side of the road, you're looking at what's in front of you. And when you have those 3 lights as part of the crossing for these rapid flashing beacons, it's actually significantly a lot more visible to the drivers than if it was a 2-lane road and you just have a light on both sides. It's not to say that we won't install on 2-lane roadways. There's situations where I think it makes sense. It's more of, it's not necessarily where you're going to be finding a lot of those lighting enhancements. So does that change in policy make sense? And does that fit in kind of the criteria of, with the Vision Zero policy that came out of the master plan, does that fit in, increasing the level of safety for the crossings that we're trying to install?
Cynthia, can you just repeat? I want to make sure I fully understood. You said that it's more useful on when there's 3 lanes versus 2, and it's just harder for them to see. I'm trying to wrap my head around why that might be so, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, so the federal studies that looked at the use of these rapid flashing beacons is that drivers were more prominent to brake earlier when it came to seeing the flashing beacons on 3-lane roads where you had 3 lights versus where it was 2-lane roads where you had 2 lights on just the outside. And so they found it safer when you had a 3-lane road with 3 lights flashing. And that's kind of the reasoning behind the policy as it stands now. It's not to say that it's not safe on a 2-lane road. It's just the primary use. There's only certain situations on a 2-lane road where it makes sense, where there's high visibility and the lighting is a little more prominent for drivers to see.
Question. On the 3-lane road, where the 3 lights, is one in the median then? Okay, that's what you mean.
I'm searching
yes.
online and I'm trying to, I'm Googling it right now and I'm trying to figure that out. So there's like a refuge in the middle usually?
Yes, yeah. So usually there would be for a 3-lane road, there would be a crossing island, and in that island or a refuge, you would have that light installed on that.
So it's more tied to whether there's something in the, sorry, Tom.
Correct.
I was
Yeah,
gonna ask-
usually for a 3-lane road, that middle lane is kind of that turning lane, and so you'll
okay.
have an island where there's a crosswalk.
I give you an example in
I'm
Issaquah.
sorry, David. David, hold on a second. I just want to make sure, Tom, because I interrupted Tom and I wanted to make sure, Tom, that you finished.
No, that's good. You answered my question as far as the definition of the 3-lane road in this case was a 2-way left turn lane with an island in the middle at the pedestrian crossing point.
Okay, so we'll go David and then Jerry. Go ahead, David. Sorry about that.
I was just saying that there is an example of what Stephen just talked about in Issaquah. If you're on Front Street South, just before, right by the swimming pool there, as Front Street South, there is an island in the middle of the road. So that would be a perfect example of what he was talking about.
Thanks. Jerry, you had a comment?
Yes, I really don't want to take up too much time, but I think with my logical mind, I mean, we had a policy for a standard crosswalk on the previous slide, then we have this beacon on this slide, and yes, I agree. Yes, perhaps traffic volume and traffic speed is more important for the beacon than it is on the previous slide, but wouldn't you want to list the same criteria for both, or am I making this more difficult? So that was my perspective. Thanks.
To respond, Jerry, the next slide actually better explains how this will be used. This is more about if and when we install one, and then the other slide will show when and where we will actually use it.
So we got a question from Joseph.
Yeah, I have a really quick question, then just a follow-up question. If I remember, you said correct, or if I heard you correctly, I think you said that rectangular flashing beacons that are solar powered or have solar panels to power them, they're more used in rural areas than urban areas. Is that correct?
Yes, though you'll still find some in downtowns or urban areas, because when they first started to get installed in cities, everybody was fond of the idea of getting solar powered, until they realized how much maintenance was required to actually maintain those. And so when comparing the hardwired ones versus solar powered, hardwired came out at a significantly lower cost.
Yeah, I just had a really quick follow-up question for that. In terms of the maintenance costs, because I feel like since it's urban areas technically or typically don't have as much forestry, like is it significantly more expensive, the maintenance cost, I guess for those solar powered rectangular flashing beacons, or is it negligible in a way? I'm sort of just curious.
It mostly depends on locations, but even in a lot of our urban areas, we have street trees installed, and so that tends to compete with kind of the airspace for a lot of these signs.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat.
Okay, I can move on to the next policy change. And this one will probably better explain how a lot of this will use. In the development of the package solutions, they're based on location characteristics. It's not important necessarily what each package is. It's which is why we don't want to provide, or why I didn't provide the table of what all the acronyms mean. It's more of giving the point of we want to use location characteristics to determine the type of devices we want to use. So the volumes, the speeds, the number of lanes on the roadway, because there's studies to support certain devices to be used in certain situations. And the use of these packages actually supports our Vision Zero goal to minimize the risk of people using the roadway. Every one of these packages are based on federal studies. And so that minimizes that risk and maximizes the level of safety we want to employ on our roadways. So what's been realized over time is that a simple template and judgment doesn't necessarily provide enough guidance for us to be consistent and tailor those solutions. So we're proposing these package solutions that fit certain roadway characteristics, and we've incorporated modern best practices on to determine what's going to be safe and comfortable for crossings at certain locations. And so one of the acronyms you'll see is RFB2 or MS4. In these packages, you'll see that certain situations might call for more signage to support installation of lighting, or certain lighting to be installed, or you are looking at flags, or you are looking at locations where maybe it's a controlled signal. So that's what signal is that's actually a pedestrian signal, where a signal, basically it's like a signalized intersection where the light turns red to stop traffic. That's a complete control of traffic, and that's where that's warranted. The rectangular flashing beacons, they're a little bit different from the signal because they're flashing yellow lights. They actually don't require a driver to stop. They are advising a driver that someone is using the crosswalk. Now, state law requires you to stop for a pedestrian, but the light itself doesn't. So that's kind of the difference between the flashing beacons and a signal. Is there any thoughts on the use of the different kind of roadway characteristics?
I have some thoughts, but I want to make sure other people have a chance to jump in. I got a little lost on what a package solution is, and nothing like a 12x4 grid table with a bunch of colors to make that even more complicated. So are you saying it's like a series? I just wasn't sure I'm not exactly sure what a package solution is, and maybe you could explain by suggesting an example. But I do understand, and I do. I think my overall comment, and this is a general comment that I'd like to hear from everybody, is that it seems like the theme here is that you're using data-driven best practices as opposed to subjectivity, which leads to inconsistency and doesn't necessarily lead to the results. And so I definitely applaud always keeping context sensitivity in mind, so that you can use your best judgment and common sense, because context is everything. But also bringing all this objectivity and analysis to remove subjectivity. I think I'm really all for. And one small community, any fatality, any collision, incident is a tragedy. And luckily we don't have so many of them that we have tons and tons of data. So I like the fact that, you've cited it several times, just, you're referring to much larger sample sizes that we can really learn from. So I definitely do appreciate that. But I don't I like Erica's comment. I don't need to use the time to speak on this. It looks like the periodic table. Yeah, maybe now's not the time to go through this, but maybe just conceptually, what do you mean by package solutions?
Sure, I'll give an example. So let's say we have a 2-lane roadway, let's say Front Street, where the speed limit is actually, we'll say it's less than 30 miles an hour, and that the vehicle volume, like daily, average daily traffic volume, is less than 9,000 vehicles per day. So in that situation, we would look at this package, MS2, which was a crosswalk, some signage, and potentially flags, depending on the situation. And so going through this list, let's say it's a situation where the speed limit's 35 miles an hour, or the vehicle speeds are 35 miles per hour, then you would look at a similar package where you're looking a little more on removing parking or adding maybe a street light to increase the visibility. And so as you go through this table from left to right, you're looking at where there's higher volumes, moving to higher speeds, and then as you go down, it's more about the number of lanes. And so that kind of differentiates the type of solution we would want to consider in those particular situations. And so each of these has their own level of flexibility, but it's a lot more specific than what we had before in terms of what kind of solution should we be considering for a two-lane road or a three-lane road.
So what you're saying is that you're going to find your situation on this chart. It's going to say RRFB2, and you're going to have some other document that shows you that RRFB2 is A, B, and C treatment / feature / facility, and that is a predefined sort of package. And you would find yourself on this chart, or you find that intersection on this chart, and then it would correspond to some kind of predetermined package that is already has a list of things.
Correct.
That do we have that somewhere? Or, I mean, you just didn't want to get into that level of detail.
Yeah, I didn't want to get into that level of detail because it's more about the policy of using this in the guidelines than what each of these really say. You're free to, it's in the guidelines, the explanation of all this for table 3. I believe it's, I'm not sure on which page it is, but I can let you all know after the meeting where you can find this in the guidelines.
I think you're right. I think we would be confused if you gave us too much, but sometimes just having an example just kind of helps clarify what it is that you're suggesting. Anyway, I'm satisfied. I think Erica's comment was just a clever one, which I agree with. Periodic table of traffic elements. I'm not seeing any other comments. Do you guys feel like this direction of being a lot more data driven and less subjective? I mean, I think it seems obvious, but I think it'd be good to hear from people. Tom says if used as a policy guide, that's good. There will be individual situations here and there. Micah says agreed. Christy says agreed. Yeah, is there anybody that just has any nuance they want to add or any concern? Sujata says agreed. Yeah, I think we're pretty clear that we're liking this direction. And Erica reminds us that it's always about people, and that we need to make sure we're telling a story, incorporating a story tied to these are real people.
Okay, I can move on to the last policy change.
Sounds good.
And Tom actually spoke to this a little bit earlier in terms of when you are establishing kind of criteria for when you install that same criteria is actually what you would use to determine if a crosswalk should be removed. And I highlight this because we didn't really have a definitive policy before. And so when we're creating this new policy and adding more definition to it, we are in a sense also creating the same policy for removal of crosswalks because we want to be consistent with what we want to do. And so I wanted to bring this for discussion on the board because when we move forward with implementation of the new policies and standards, that means we're going to have to look at all the existing crossings and what's in place to determine if what's there actually should be there, and potentially make changes. And so I wanted to get the board's thoughts on that.
This is Tom, and I'd agree with the thought process, that's what you're talking about, Steve. Whether it functions there or if it's not the best place for it, and then how to remove it then.
Yeah, so Jerry says, good idea. We haven't heard from Alec, so I'm just going to give you a heads up. I'm hoping to hear from you before we wrap. Sujata also says, I agree. And I just was going to make a comment that it seems counterintuitive that crosswalks, if you have too many, they can make them less safe. I totally believe you, and I think the logic is sound. That's why we have engineers. But I think it's important for us all to understand, if I'm understanding correctly, that removing them would be because of what did you call it? Driver expectations, and just this whole concept of too many and ultimately contributing to a less safe environment. And just, I just want to sort of say that out loud, make sure I'm understanding it correctly so that we can all kind of internalize that concept, because I think it's pretty important. Because it seems to me counterintuitive. It seems like, if one crosswalk will save one life, then why would you take it out? But I think that the case you make it makes perfect sense to me when you think about it the way Stephen and then with Tom's help describe that. So is that the primary reason that you would remove a crosswalk? And Erica has a question. So Stephen, maybe you can answer my question, and then Erica, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, yeah. To answer your question, the primary reason we would want to remove a crosswalk is because we believe it would be making the situation less safe. We only want to have the crosswalks in locations where it's actually enhancing the environment and making people feel comfortable. Even though naturally crosswalks tend to have people feel comfortable, one thing, not everybody looks at state collision data, but if you look at it, you'll look at close to 50% of a lot of the collisions when it comes to pedestrians and cars are actually in crosswalks. And so thinking about that, it's important to know that we really want to make sure we're very strategic and specific on where we install crosswalks and or enhancements.
Erica, and then Jerry, go ahead and make your comment after Erica's done.
Is there any kind of public notice when the city's looking at removing a crosswalk somewhere?
When we would go in for a crosswalk removal, we would actually talk to the neighborhood. We wouldn't just go in and decide. We would talk to the neighborhood first.
And then Jerry, you had a comment, and Stephen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I like to read the content of the chat because the chat doesn't get recorded made a part of the record, and they're certainly not as accessible on the video. So it's good to let chair or the staff know that you have a question or you have a comment. But I do think it's important to read those into the record. Stephen, do you agree with that? And
yes, yeah, the chat does not get recorded into the video. So please, if you have a question, just kind of speak it or let us know that you have a question or comment and then speak it on the video.
yeah, and I've been monitoring it. So anytime someone said something like they agree or said something substantive, I've repeated it, but or invited the person to repeat it. So with that in mind, Jerry, you made an interesting comment, and I think you should just mention it.
Okay, I was just trying to be brief, but it's just another reason for the removal is if a new, more modern crosswalk is installed close by. And for instance, the Juniper Street, Gilman, they're putting in a new signal there. And then there is right now a crosswalk a little bit further to the, I guess it's west. And so I'm thinking that you guys are going to remove that. That's a specific instance. And so I'm thinking part of this removal policy would take that into account too, right?
Yes, yeah, they're in the policy. There's kind of a proximity to the next crossing that we do take into account. At the same time, even if the policy right now says about 200 feet in urban areas, which would what it would be on Gilman or at the location that you were speaking about. But if that crossing location were close to the entrance to the shopping center that's right there, and so it warrants people crossing at that location, then we might actually keep it. But it really kind of depends on the situation. The new crossing that you were speaking of is more specific to the trail, and I believe the other one is getting taken out. But if for some reason there is a shopping center entrance over closer to the other one, that might actually be considered to be kept down. So we do kind of take the context into the decision making process, but we're making sure that at least the selection of the solutions are a little more data driven.
I just want to editorialize and say I'm super psyched about that new crossing. I cross that all the time, and it's so tempting just to go to follow the trail, and you don't want to go around and go to that crosswalk. But I've played chicken across the Gilman so many times, and I'm so psyched that that's going in.
Does anybody know when it will be started? Maybe not. When it'll be implemented, it will be opened, that new signal.
I'm not sure of the timing of it, but I can get back to the board about that project.
Yeah, and I think
it's getting close.
Right now a little bit unknown because they're trying to resolve an issue with PSC, but we'll try and get some good information.
Stephen, are you getting what you were hoping to get?
Yes. No, this is great. If there's no more final comments or questions, I can move on. I think I'm done.
I only had one other question, and that's you did include the crossing guidelines draft, and I did spend some time with them. I always get nervous when we get documents like that because I wonder if we're being expected to review them in detail. Was it more for context, or would you like feedback specifically on that draft?
It was more for context. Everyone's feel free to read through it just to see kind of the work that was put together, but it is more of a technical document. Which is why we were kind of part of it is because we're moving in the more data-driven approach. But it's more of these policy changes that I was really looking for feedback on, because we'll have these similar discussions with the city council.
Okay. Well, does that wrap item 4C?
Yes, I am good if the board is good to move forward.
Anyone else have any other comments? Okay. Hearing none, we'll go to item 5. We'll start with the board work plan. Stephen, I assume that's you.
Yes, I can take that really quick. For the board work plan, we'll be looking at April 13th for the racial equity training, which will take up our whole meeting for next month, and then our next meeting will be in May. Which one thing that may be changing as part of our work plan, which isn't reflected on the work plan that you'll see now, is that I think we may be moving in the direction of having multiple smaller discussions, follow-up discussions on transportation and equity. Because after I talked it over with the city's consultant, it made more sense for us to, actually I stopped showing my screen. It makes more sense for us to have multiple group discussions to talk through it versus trying to cram it all into 2 to 3 meetings, because it takes up a lot of time, but it's better for everybody to kind of have a chance to think about the information and process it, and then kind of come back to the group for a more robust conversation. And so I'll talk it over with the chairs, and we'll kind of determine how that might change the work plan itself for the rest of the year.
Said April 13th, so you may have told us this already and I'd already forgotten, but that's a Tuesday and we normally meet the third Thursday. We switched?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, it'll be a special meeting in April to accommodate the consultant's schedule. So it'll be that Tuesday that week.
And we will not have one on that Thursday.
Correct. This will be in place of our regular monthly meeting,
Okay,
unless you want to meet again on that Thursday.
that's fine. I just wanted to make sure. And then, is that your staff report, or do you have a staff report also?
Both of them,
I also-
13th is a Tuesday.
I have a little additional information, unless there are questions about the board.
Sorry, Tom. It sounded like Tom had something he was trying to say or ask.
Sorry, I was just saying the 12th is Monday and 13th is a Tuesday.
Yeah, we were saying Tuesday the 13th.
Okay.
And I'll be sending out a schedule later this month, but we're changing the format for our meeting, so it'll be very similar invite, but it'll be kind of a different format for the meeting itself. And then I can move on to the staff report if there are no other questions. Okay. For our staff report, so to follow up on the TIP discussions for the board, we submitted the TAP to the administration. Council will get a presentation on April 19th. And for that meeting, board members from all the boards and commissions will be invited to provide comments on the proposed program. This could be a lot of you or just a few of you. We can decide later. I can have a discussion with the chair about how to kind of coordinate that. Tuesday, that's on that same week, the Tuesday, April 20th, staff is going to hold a community meeting on the entire CAP, the Capital Improvement Program or Plan, to extend kind of the public outreach process as part of that, the development of the CIP. And then the public hearing for the whole CIP will be on May 3rd and May 17th. And May 17th is the planned adoption date for council. That concludes my staff report.
Could you repeat the 2 May dates?
Yes, it's
The public
May
hearing.
3rd and May 17th.
May 3rd was the public hearing. May 17th was.
The council meeting for planned adoption.
Got it. Okay. I don't have a chair report. I just want to say that vaccines are rolling out, and I hope that the day that we can all resume meeting in person is not too far away. I admit I do like being able to roll into another room without a lot of physical preparation, like traveling or putting on regular clothes, but it's not the same, and I'm looking forward to us being in the same room. And all the little side conversations that happen before and after. So I don't, but I don't have a report besides that. Do we have a youth report?
Really quick, Christy, did you have a question on the staff report?
I was just going to ask, we received a couple of public comments to the tab about the Newport project, and I just wanted to inquire if those individuals would be encouraged to publicly speak during the public hearing for the capital improvement TIP.
Christy, I have a question. Are you talking about the letter about the crossing for the King County Trailhead?
Yes.
So for that one, we've been working with the communications team to respond to the resident, and the resident reached out to the city in various ways. And so I'll make sure that the response gets back to the tab since you guys went to it or received the communication in the first place.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that.
Christy, sorry I didn't notice that in the chat, so thanks somebody else for noticing it. I guess I just want to maybe ask Stephen and to share with the group. I usually review anything that comes into the tab, but I assume that it's not really appropriate for us to engage by email on those kinds of
Typically, in those situations where someone emails the entire board, the chairs will kind of decide how to respond if they want to respond, and usually in coordination with staff. With that situation where the particular community member was already in contact with the city staff, we just kind of reiterated a lot of the response that we had already provided. But we'll, as John said, we'll make sure that the board receives the response that we had sent out.
Thanks. Thanks, Christy, for bringing that up. I'd forgotten about that already. Do we have a youth report?
Yeah, I guess I can make this isn't exactly a youth report. I'll just make this really quick though, since it's already 8. So based off of the survey feedback that I received from like the I guess youth board, I'm pretty much planning to figure out a city proposal that will help address like concerns or interests that youth saw in the sort of transportation infrastructure that they want to see implemented. So yeah, that's pretty much my youth report.
Thank you. I think next time if we get done early, we can do for the good of the order, but it is already just after 8, and so I'm pretty committed to ending on time, if that's okay with everyone. You can always send me comments about how things are going with running the meetings and so forth. But with that, it looks like, is there any other business or announcements besides the fact that April 13th? Okay. Do we need to make, we don't need to make a motion to adjourn. We just get to adjourn. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I will adjourn the meeting and wish you all a good evening. And I'm really looking forward to our equity training next month. And thank you all for being here.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.